Light in my kitchen was too sharp that morning. The kind of flat white light that makes everything look like evidence. My son had called me the night before, which wasn't unusual. He called every Sunday. What was unusual was that he called on a Thursday at 9:47 p.m., and when I picked up, the first thing he said wasn't hello. It was, "Mom, are you sitting down?" I was standing at the sink rinsing a coffee mug. I sat down. His name is Elliot. He turned 43 that past February. I made him a lemon pound cake because that's what he asked for every year since he was 7. He drove 2 hours from Charlotte to sit at my kitchen table and eat 3 slices of that cake and let me fuss over the gray that was starting to come in at his temples. That was 4 months before the phone call. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to not ask me any questions until I'm finished." I held the mug in both hands even though it was empty. He told me he had changed the beneficiary on his life insurance policy. He told me he had updated his will. He told me his financial advisor had transferred the majority of his liquid assets, just over $2.3 million, into a separate account, and that account was now in my name. I said, "Elliot." He said, "Mom, you promised." I closed my mouth. He said the house was still being handled. He said there were things he couldn't explain yet. He said he needed me to write down a number, a name, and an address, and he needed me to keep that paper somewhere no one would find it, not in my phone, not in my email, on paper, in a place only I knew. I got up and found a pen. I wrote down what he told me. His voice was calm the entire time. That calm scared me more than anything else, he said. When he was finished, he said, "I love you, Mom. I always thought you deserved better than what life gave you." I wanted to do something about that while I still could. I asked him what he meant by while I still could. He said he had to go. He'd call me on Sunday. He did not call me on Sunday. A neighbor knocked on my door at 6 a.m. that Saturday. She had driven up from Charlotte herself, which told me before she opened her mouth that something had happened that couldn't be said over the phone. She was a friend of my daughter-in-law's. I had met her twice. Her name was Louise, and she had kind eyes, and she couldn't look at me directly when she told me that Elliot had collapsed Friday evening at his office, that he had been taken by ambulance to Atrium Health Maine, that he had not survived. I remember asking her what time. She said a little after 8. I remember thinking that at 8 o'clock Friday evening I had been watching the news. I had been sitting in my recliner with my reading glasses on my head and the volume too loud because I hadn't bothered to find the remote. My son was dying and I was watching the weather forecast. I didn't cry right away. That worried Louise. She kept touching my arm and asking if I needed water. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. I just didn't know yet how to be anything other than still. I called my daughter. I called my son's best friend, a man named Quentin, who had known Elliot since they were 12 years old. I did not call my daughter-in-law, whose name is Serena, because something in Louise's voice when she mentioned Serena's name told me not to. I couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, the kind you learn to trust after 61 years of having them. The funeral was held 9 days later. I sat in the front row. Serena sat next to me with her mother on her other side, and her mother's hand never left Serena's arm the whole service. I watched the pastor speak. I watched the slideshow of photographs. There was one of Elliot at maybe 10 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, holding up a fish he'd caught at my father's pond in South Carolina. I had taken that picture. I remembered the exact afternoon. I held myself together until I saw that photograph. Then I didn't. Serena called me 11 days after the funeral. She said she wanted to come by and talk. She said there were some things that needed to be sorted out regarding Elliot's estate. She asked if Friday afternoon worked. I said that was fine. I did not mention the phone call. I did not mention the paper I had hidden in the pages of the King James Bible on my nightstand, third chapter of Ruth, because Elliot had known that was where I kept important things since he was old enough to notice. I did not mention the name of the attorney whose number I had written on that paper, a man named Arthur Beckwith in Charlotte, who I had called 3 days after Elliot's death and who had told me, very carefully and very clearly, that I needed to come see him before I spoke to anyone about Elliot's finances. I had seen him 2 days before Serena called. I knew, going into that Friday, what I was walking into. What I did not expect was that Serena would not come alone. She arrived with her mother, whose name is Renata, and Renata's brother, a man I had met exactly once at the wedding rehearsal dinner. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm. He introduced himself again, as if I'd forgotten, held out his hand, and smiled with all his teeth. I did not smile back. I let them in. I offered coffee. Only Serena accepted. They sat across from me at my dining room table. Renata's brother, I will call him the uncle because that is what he was, though not mine, opened the portfolio. He took out a set of documents. He placed them on the table and slid them toward me. He said Elliot had put together a family trust some years ago. He said the primary beneficiary of that trust, per Elliot's own documentation, was his spouse. He said there were assets that had been incorrectly transferred, his word was incorrectly, and that the family simply wanted to resolve things quietly out of respect for everyone's grief. Serena looked at the table when he said that. She did not look at me. I looked at the documents. I did not touch them. I asked if I could have a moment. I got up and walked to my bedroom. I opened my nightstand drawer. I took out the paper with Arthur Beckwith's instructions on it, which I had read enough times by then that I nearly had it memorized. One of the things he had told me, if anyone presents you with documents, do not sign them. Do not touch them if possible. Simply say your attorney will be in touch. I walked back to the dining room. I sat down. I told them I appreciated them coming. I told them any conversations about Elliot's estate would need to go through my attorney, and that his office would be in contact within the week. The uncle looked at Renata. Renata looked at Serena. Serena finally looked at me. She said, "He didn't mean for this to happen like this, Beverly." And then she stopped herself and corrected. She said my name, my actual name, not Beverly. I think she had rehearsed something and gotten mixed up. I said, "I think it's best if we let our attorneys handle the rest of this." They left 20 minutes later. The uncle took his documents with him. I went to my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and shook for about 5 minutes. Then I called Arthur Beckwith and told him what had happened. Elliot's actual will was not the document the uncle had presented to me. Arthur had already obtained a certified copy from the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. The will had been filed 14 months before Elliot died. In it, he left his primary residence in Charlotte to Serena, as well as the furniture, both vehicles, and his personal accounts held jointly in their names. Everything else, his investment portfolio, his business interest in a logistics company he had built with Quinton, and the separately held account that had been transferred to my name, went to me. There was a line in the will that I have read many times since. It said, "To my mother, who always kept the light on, I leave everything I built alone." Arthur told me the document the uncle had brought to my house was a competing will, one that had apparently been drafted 11 months earlier, before Elliot had updated his actual filing. It was, as far as Arthur could determine, a legitimate document in the sense that it bore Elliot's signature, but it had been superseded. It had no legal standing. I asked Arthur if that was the end of it. He paused before he answered, which told me it wasn't. Serena's family hired an attorney of their own within the week. They filed a formal challenge to the will, arguing undue influence, the argument being that I had somehow pressured Elliot, in his final months, into changing his estate plan in my favor. Anyone who knew Elliot would have found that argument almost funny. He was not a man who could be pressured. He had fired a business partner at 31 over an ethical disagreement and eaten the financial loss without complaint. He had ended a 5-year relationship rather than compromise on something he believed was right. He made his own decisions and he stood behind them. But I understood what the challenge was really about. It was about the logistics company. Elliot and Quentin had built that company from nothing over 12 years. It was generating just under $4 million in annual revenue by the time Elliot died. Serena's family had been aware of its value. What they apparently had not been aware of was that Elliot had restructured his ownership stake 8 months before his death, transferring his shares to a trust, the same trust Arthur had told me about, rather than leaving them exposed in the estate. Quentin called me the week after the challenge was filed. He said he knew something was coming, and he set everything up so they couldn't touch it. His voice broke a little when he said it. I asked him how long he had known something was wrong. He said Elliot had come to him about 6 months before he died, that he had seemed frightened in a way Quentin had never seen before, that he'd talked about Serena's family in a way he never had, their interest in the business, questions they'd been asking, pressure they'd been applying. Elliot had told Quentin that he didn't want to alarm me, that he was handling it, that he'd put things in order so that whatever happened I'd be taken care of. I sat in my kitchen with my phone pressed against my ear and the late afternoon light coming through the window, and I thought about my son sitting across a desk from his attorney, making careful decisions about how to protect the people he loved while he was still here to do it. I set down the phone after I hung up with Quentin, and I let myself cry properly for the first time since Louise had stood in my doorway 9 days after that phone call. The legal process took 8 months. I will not walk through every detail of those 8 months, because some of it is still too close, and because the parts that matter can be said plainly. Arthur found inconsistencies in the earlier will, the one the uncle had brought to my house. The date of notarization didn't match the date range of the notary seal being used, which had been issued to that notary after the will was supposedly signed. It was a small discrepancy, the kind of thing you would never catch unless you were specifically looking. Arthur was specifically looking. The challenge was dismissed. The competing will was ruled invalid. Elliot's actual estate plan was upheld in full. Serena's family appealed. The appeal was denied. In late spring, about 10 months after Elliot died, I received confirmation that the transfer of his business interest was fully settled. Quentin offered to buy out my share at fair market value, which I accepted. I did not want to run a logistics company. I wanted what Elliot had intended. For me to have security, stability, the things he had always felt guilty that I'd gone without when he was growing up. And I was raising him and his sister on one income and a lot of prayer. I put a portion of the money into a college fund for my granddaughter, Elliot's daughter, from a brief relationship years ago. A little girl named Lena, who is 8 years old and has her father's eyes and his habit of going quiet when she's thinking hard about something. Elliot paid her mother child support and was present as much as he could be, and had remembered her in his estate planning separately from everything else. He had thought of everyone. That is the kind of man he was. There are things I wish I had done differently. I wish I had asked him on that Thursday night phone call to tell me more. I kept my promise and stayed quiet and let him say what he needed to say, but I have spent a long time wondering if there was something in his voice I didn't push on hard enough. Something that might have told me how close to the edge things already were. I wish I had called Arthur Beckwith the morning after the call instead of waiting 3 days. I was in shock, and I told myself I was respecting Elliot's process, letting him handle things his way. But 3 days was 3 days. I wish I had not let Serena and her mother and the uncle sit at my dining room table at all. I should have spoken to them through the screen door and told them to contact my attorney from the start. I was trying to be civil. Elliot would have understood the impulse. He was raised to be civil too. But I also know that being civil was not what cost him. He knew what he was dealing with long before the end. He handled it. He just couldn't tell me everything because he was protecting me, the way he had always tried to protect me, right up until he had nothing left to give except a carefully constructed set of legal documents and a line in a will about keeping the light on. The Bible is still on my nightstand. The paper is still inside the 3rd chapter of Ruth, though I've moved it to the front of the book because there's no longer any reason to hide it. On Sunday mornings, I still reach for my phone out of habit. The habit has softened a little with time. Not much, but a little. Lena came to visit me last month with her mother. She sat at my kitchen table and ate 3 slices of lemon pound cake and asked me if the recipe was hard to learn. I told her no. I told her I'd teach her whenever she was ready. She said she was ready now, so we made it together. She stood on the step stool Elliot used to use when he was small, stirring the batter with both hands, very serious, the way she gets when something matters to her. I watched her and I thought, he knew exactly what he was doing, every bit of it. The phone call, the documents, the attorney's name on a piece of paper tucked into the book of Ruth. He built something real and made sure it would last, and now it belongs to her too. That was his final act. Not revenge, not a legal maneuver. A decision made by a man who loved the people in his life more than he feared the ones who didn't. I am 61 years old. I have outlived my mother and my husband and now my firstborn son. I have sat across tables from people who wanted things that didn't belong to them and watched them leave empty-handed. I have learned that the light doesn't go out just because someone tries to turn it off. Elliot knew that. He learned it in this kitchen, at this table, with flour on his hands and that gap-toothed smile. I think about that every time I turn on the light. I've thought about cause and effect a lot since all of this ended. Not in an abstract way, in the specific, close-up way you think about things when they actually happen to you, when you can trace every moment back to a decision someone made. Elliot made his decisions carefully. That's the thing people don't always understand when I tell this story. They hear he died young, and they hear his wife's family came after the money, and they think the story is about loss and greed, which it is partly. But underneath that, it's about what happens when a person builds their life on honest ground. When everything a man does, every business deal, every legal document, every late-night phone call to his mother, comes from a place of genuine care rather than self-protection, there is a kind of order that follows, not magic, not luck, just the natural result of real choices made over a long time. Serena's family operated from a different foundation. They moved fast. They brought documents that weren't what they claimed to be. They came to my house 11 days after I buried my son and sat across my table with confidence I now understand was borrowed. Confidence built on the assumption that I was alone, uninformed, and too deep in grief to push back. That assumption was wrong, and it was wrong because Elliot had made sure it would be wrong. He had thought further ahead than they did. He had been more honest and more precise, and in the end, that precision is what held. I think about what it cost him to make that phone call, to sit wherever he was sitting that Thursday night and find the words to tell me what he needed to tell me without telling me everything, without alarming me beyond what I could hold. That took intelligence. The real kind, not the kind that's just sharp, but the kind that knows how to carry weight without dropping it on someone else. And it took something I want to name plainly, because I think it gets overlooked. It took character. Elliot was afraid. I know that now. Quentin told me things that confirmed it, but he didn't let the fear make him sloppy or reactive. He went to his attorney. He restructured what needed to be restructured. He wrote a will with language that was clean and clear and specific. He protected his daughters separately. He thought about everyone. That is not what a frightened man does when he has no foundation. That is what a frightened man does when the foundation is solid and he knows how to use it. I did my part. I didn't always do it perfectly. I waited 3 days to call Arthur when I should have called him the next morning. I'd let those people sit at my table when I should have spoken to them through a cracked door. But I called the attorney. I kept the paper in the Bible. I did not sign anything I wasn't supposed to sign. Elliot had raised me to handle things in the same way I had raised him, not by telling me what to do, but by trusting me with what I needed to know. What I want people to take from this is not a lesson about estate planning, though that matters too. What I want people to take is this: the choices you make when you are not under pressure determine how you survive the moments when you are. Elliot had been building something honest for 20 years. That honesty did not protect him from dying young. Nothing could have done that. But it meant that when the people who wanted to take what he'd built arrived at my door, they found a wall they hadn't expected. They found documents that were already in order. They found a mother who had already made the right call. Lena will know this story when she's older. Not all of it, not all at once. But she'll know that her father was the kind of man who thought about the people he loved before he thought about himself. That's not a small thing to inherit. That is, in fact, everything.